Europe is now burning at a pace it has never recorded before. As of the latest European forest fire information data, nearly 435,000 hectares have gone up in flames since January. That's more than 1 million acres, and it already exceeds the worst year ever recorded on the continent, which was just last year. More than 1,400 individual fires have been mapped this year alone, more than double the 20-year average. 3 firefighters were killed in Greece this week. Hundreds of thousands of people across France and Spain have been forced from their homes. And the heat driving all of it is not letting up. Let's get right into it. The scale of what's unfolding across Europe right now is difficult to overstate. According to the Joint Research Center's official fire monitoring service, this year's burned area is running 43% above the 20-year late July average. It's already ahead of 2025's pace, and 2025 was the worst year on record. Nearly 18 million tons of carbon dioxide have been released from these fires so far this year, well above both last year's total at this point and the historical average. This isn't one country having a bad summer. This is a continental emergency stretching from Portugal's Atlantic coast to the islands of Greece, and it's touching nearly every country in between. Let's break this down region by region, because the story is different in every country, even as the underlying cause stays exactly the same. Let's start in France, because France is dealing with one of the worst fire years in its modern history. According to the country's Interior Ministry, roughly 115,000 hectares have burned nationwide since the start of the year. That's over 284,000 acres, and officials say it has already broken the country's record for a full year of fires, with a month still to go before typical fire season even ends. The hardest hit region is Gironde, in the southwest, where a blaze tearing through dense pine forest near Bordeaux grew so large and so hot that it generated its own thunderstorm. That's a fire-driven weather system capable of sparking entirely new ignitions miles away from the original blaze. More than 42,000 hectares have burned in Gironde alone, an area roughly 4 times the size of the city of Paris. Officials say that fire has slowed, but it has not been contained. A fresh heat wave moving into the region this week threatens to reignite it further. Temperatures in the area are expected to climb as high as 42 degrees Celsius, that's nearly 108 degrees Fahrenheit, with dry winds forecast to fuel the fire lines. Even more, France has evacuated roughly 220,000 people from their homes since this crisis began, one of the largest civilian evacuations tied to wildfire in the country's history. Now let's move into Spain, because Spain's fire season this year is almost impossible to put into perspective without the actual numbers. According to Copernicus satellite data, Spain has now burned through 207,000 hectares nationwide. That's more than 511,000 acres, nearly 5 times the average for this point in the year. Spain also recorded its largest wildfire on record this year, burning west of Madrid across the provinces of Vila and Toledo. More than 45,000 hectares have burned in that fire zone alone. It forced residents of 7 entire housing estates out of their homes, some of whom are still unable to return. Spain's prime minister has since declared the national emergency over in the regions of Vila and Madrid. But officials say that declaration doesn't mean the danger has passed, it means one specific fire has stabilized. Within hours of that announcement, a new fire broke out near the Portuguese border, forcing the evacuation of another 600 people. Roughly 100,000 people across Spain have been evacuated at some point during this crisis. Another 30,000 have been ordered to shelter in place rather than risk travel through active fire zones. Spain's National Weather Agency has warned that fire risk remains very high to extreme across most of the country, and that warning has not been lifted. Let's talk about Greece, because this week brought the most tragic development of the entire European fire season so far. 3 firefighters were killed battling blazes in Greece. Officials confirmed this week. That's a devastating loss and a stark reminder of what these crews are risking every single day this season. As of the most recent update, several new wildfires have broken out across Greece, forcing the evacuation of multiple villages. Crete has become a particular flashpoint, with firefighters battling blazes on the island for a second consecutive day as of the latest report. Greece's fire danger has been compounded by the same heat wave, pattern driving fires across France and Spain. Officials there are warning that conditions could remain volatile through the rest of August. Neighboring Turkey is facing a nearly identical situation, with fires spreading rapidly enough that the European Union's crisis chief specifically called out both countries this week while urging tougher continental climate action. Portugal, too, remains deeply affected, even though it hasn't dominated headlines the way France. Spain and Greece have this week. Fires have continued to break out across the country's central regions. Strong winds have repeatedly complicated containment efforts for crews already stretched thin from weeks of continuous fire activity. Portugal activated the European Civil Protection Mechanism earlier this season, formally requesting emergency assistance from other EU member states. That's a request that isn't made lightly, and one that signals just how overwhelmed national resources had become. Behind every hectare number tonight, there are real families whose entire summer has been defined by evacuation orders instead of vacations. In Spain, residents of Palaos de la Presa, roughly 80 kilometers southwest of Madrid, have returned to homes so severely damaged by fire that they now have to be demolished entirely. In Gironde, tens of thousands of French residents and tourists alike were forced out of the region during what should have been peak summer travel season across the continent. More than 325,000 people have been displaced from their homes in France and Spain alone since this crisis began. That number doesn't even include Greece, Portugal, or Italy. This is not an abstract climate statistic playing out on a chart somewhere. This is hundreds of thousands of real people who spent this summer packing go bags instead of beach bags. So why is this happening across an entire continent at the same time? It comes down to a heatwave pattern that has been building since the very start of the year and simply refuses to break. According to Deutsche Welle and multiple European meteorological agencies, this wildfire season followed directly on the heels of a record-breaking June heatwave, with above-average temperatures expected to persist straight through the summer. Hot, dry, and windy weather has now been the dominant pattern across the EU for months. European climate monitors say this year's conditions have been 43% more severe than the 20-year late July average. That's not a small deviation, that's a fundamental shift in what a normal European summer now looks like. Scientists studying this pattern have been direct about the cause: inflamed by carbon pollution. This combination of extended heat, low humidity, and persistent wind has created what fire officials describe as some of the most dangerous conditions the continent has ever tracked in a single season. Let's talk about the resources being committed to this crisis, because the scale of the response matches the scale of the emergency. Spain alone has deployed thousands of firefighters nationwide, battling what officials described as 14 major fires burning simultaneously at the peak of this outbreak. France has mobilized similarly large numbers of crews to the Gironde region alone, given the size and behavior of that fire. Beyond national resources, multiple countries have now formally requested help through the European Civil Protection Mechanism, which allows EU member states to pool firefighting aircraft, crews, and equipment across borders when a single country's resources are overwhelmed. That mechanism has been activated repeatedly this season. That's a clear sign that no single European country currently has the capacity to handle this crisis entirely on its own. Aerial firefighting assets, including water bomber aircraft shared between member states, have been repositioned multiple times this summer to whichever country's fires are burning hottest at that moment. That kind of cross-border resource sharing has become almost routine this season. That itself says something about how stretched every national firefighting service across the continent has become. Now let's put this season into historical context, because the scale of the shift here is genuinely alarming. Wildfires destroyed 2.2 million hectares of land across Europe in 2025 alone, according to United Nations data. That's up sharply from 1.4 million hectares in 2022, which had itself been considered an extreme year at the time. This year is already outpacing 2025's record-setting numbers at the same point on the calendar, according to the EU's own Joint Research Centre. Every single benchmark European fire monitors track total hectares burned, total fire count, total carbon emissions is running above both last year's record pace and the 20-year historical average simultaneously. There is no version of this data that shows Europe trending in a safer direction. Climate researchers who study this pattern point to a straightforward chain of cause and effect. Rising baseline temperatures across the continent are extending the length of fire season on both ends. Reduced summer rainfall in southern and western Europe leaves vegetation drier for longer stretches than historical norms would predict. That combination doesn't just make individual fires worse, it makes the entire season longer, giving crews less time to recover between major incidents. Let's take a quick look at the wider picture, because this crisis isn't confined to just the countries making headlines this week. Very extreme fire danger conditions currently stretch across Western and Central Europe, with the heaviest concentration running through France and the Alpine Arc, extending north into Italy. Extreme conditions surround that zone as well, covering the wider Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, and parts of North Africa. Even the British Isles and Ireland are currently sitting under very extreme fire danger ratings, an unusual designation for a region not typically associated with wildfire risk at this scale. Very high danger stretches further still, across southern Scandinavia and into parts of Eastern Europe. In short, there is functionally no region on the continent right now sitting comfortably outside an elevated fire risk category. Italy is one of the countries fire monitors are watching most closely as this pattern extends north. The Alpine Arc extending into northern Italy currently sits under the same very extreme danger classification as Gironde and the worst hit zones of southwestern France. Italian authorities have not yet dealt with a single blaze on the scale of what France and Spain are managing, but officials there say the underlying conditions, extended heat, low humidity, and persistent wind, are effectively identical to what preceded the largest fires further west and south. The Balkans, too, remain under extreme fire danger, a region that has dealt with severe wildfire activity in recent summers and is now facing another season shaped by the same continental heat pattern. Parts of North Africa sit under that same extreme classification, adding yet another region to a list that already includes most of Western and Southern Europe. Beyond the immediate danger to homes and lives, the economic toll of a season like this one is significant and still climbing. Tourism across southern France and northern Spain has taken a direct hit during what should be peak summer season, with entire regions evacuated or placed under travel advisories during the busiest weeks of the year for local economies. Agricultural losses are mounting across fire-affected farmland in Spain and Portugal, where vineyards, orchards, and grazing land have burned alongside forest and brush. Insurance losses tied to this season are expected to climb sharply as claims are filed across multiple countries simultaneously. That's an unusual strain on insurers, who typically handle one severe fire season at a time rather than several countries at once. None of that is the headline tonight, but it's part of the full picture as this season continues to unfold across the continent. Now let's talk about air quality, because wildfire smoke across a continent this size doesn't stay confined to the fire zones themselves. Smoke from the largest blazes in France and Spain has already begun affecting air quality readings well beyond the immediate fire perimeters, according to regional monitoring agencies. Communities downwind of the largest fires are being advised to limit outdoor activity, keep windows closed, and monitor local air quality indexes closely as smoke drifts across regional and national borders. Defense officials in Spain have specifically noted that thick smoke has made aerial firefighting operations more difficult in several zones. That's slowing down exactly the kind of aircraft response that's needed to contain fires of this size quickly. Looking ahead, there is no meaningful relief in sight for the continent as a whole. A fresh heat wave is already moving into southwestern France this week, threatening to reignite fire activity in zones that had only just begun to stabilize. Spain's National Weather Agency continues to warn that fire risk remains very high to extreme across most of the country, with no significant shift in that forecast expected in the coming days. European climate monitors say the underlying pattern behind this season, extended heat, persistent dryness, and repeated wind events, shows no sign of breaking before the traditional end of fire season later this autumn. If this year continues on its current trajectory, European officials say it is on pace to surpass 2025 as the worst wildfire season the continent has ever recorded. If you're anywhere in an affected region across Europe right now, here is what officials are asking residents and travelers to do. First, know your evacuation status before you need it. Local authorities across France, Spain, and Greece have been issuing rapid evacuation orders with very little advance notice as fires shift with the wind. Second, if you're traveling through any affected region this summer, check regional transportation status before departing. High-speed rail lines and major highways have already been suspended or closed in multiple countries due to nearby fire activity. Third, keep a charged phone and a printed list of emergency contacts on hand at all times, particularly if you're in an unfamiliar area as a tourist rather than a local resident who already knows the terrain. Fourth, if local officials issue any evacuation order, leave immediately rather than waiting to gather belongings. Homes in multiple countries this season have been lost specifically because residents delayed evacuation to retrieve possessions. Fifth, if you're in a region under an air quality advisory, treat it seriously even if you can't visually see smoke nearby, since wildfire smoke can travel hundreds of kilometers before dispersing. And finally, follow only official government and emergency service channels for updates, since misinformation about fire locations and containment status has already complicated evacuation efforts in several regions this season. If you're a tourist rather than a local resident, register with your embassy or consulate's local travel advisory system if one is available. Embassies have been actively assisting with evacuation logistics in several of the hardest-hit regions this summer. And if you're planning travel to any of these regions in the coming weeks, check official government travel advisories before booking or departing. Fire zones and evacuation areas have shifted rapidly and repeatedly throughout this season. This is a genuinely continental crisis, and it is still evolving day by day. We've seen French crews battle a fire so intense it created its own weather system. We've seen Spain declare and then immediately walk back a national emergency as new fires ignited within hours. We've lost 3 firefighters in Greece this week alone, a loss that every crew still on the line across the continent is carrying with them tonight. We've watched Portugal formally request outside help after weeks of continuous fire activity stretched its own resources past what any single country could reasonably sustain. We've seen entire high-speed rail lines suspended in Spain, entire housing estates evacuated west of Madrid, and entire regions of southwestern France emptied out during what should have been the busiest tourism weeks of the year. None of that changes the forecast for the days ahead, but all of it should tell you exactly how seriously this crisis is being treated by the people fighting it directly on the ground. I'll be back with updates as containment numbers shift and as this next heat wave moves through France and Spain over the coming days. To every firefighter on the line across this continent tonight, in Gironde, in Vila, in Crete, and everywhere in between, thank you. Your work under these conditions does not go unnoticed. If tonight's update helped you understand what's actually happening across Europe right now, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Stay safe out there and take care of each other.